Hello everyone, my name is Hteik. So today I'll be presenting about why nations fail. So this is basically a presentation about why some countries are rich and some countries are poor. So this is actually taken from a book called Why Nations Fail itself, especially from chapter 3 and chapter 15. So let's get started. So on the left side, you will see a very rich country, and on the right side, you will see a much poorer country. And you might be wondering what makes these two countries rich and one poor. So this is from the book itself. It mentions that even the poorest citizens of the United States have incomes and access to healthcare, education, and public services, and economic and social opportunities that are far superior to those available to the vast mass of people living in sub-Saharan African, South Asian, and Central America. So it says even if you're born or even if you're in US and even if you're poor, you will still have access to income and access to healthcare and also education and stuff like that. But if you are in a much poorer countries, you don't have those access and you don't have those privileges. So we're going to find out why is it so and what actually makes one country rich and one poor. So this is actually nothing more than the product of political institutions and economic institutions. So political institutions, they are basically the institutions that enact laws and that regulate the economy. But for economic institutions, these are basically the ones that deal with money and also distribute wealth in the system. So that's pretty straightforward. So we'll start looking at different types of political institutions. So it could be broken down into two types of institutions. One is basically inclusive and another one is extractive. And we're going to see what is the difference between these two, especially on the basis of political institutions. So the first one is if you are an inclusive political institution, then the power distribution is plural. That means everyone can actually vote to elect a government, and they can also have say in the opinion, and they can also express their freedom of choice and stuff like that. But it's also centralized. So that means it actually governs the whole country, the federal level, and as well as the local authorities. But for extractive political institutions, the power is actually concentrated in the hands of very few rich and powerful people. That's what we call absolutist. And there's also no centralization as well. So in terms of economic institutions, again, there are two types of economic institutions. One is inclusive and another one is extractive. So in terms of property rights, if you are in an inclusive system, you're going to have very secure property rights. But if you are extractive, then you're going to have insecure property rights. So what does it mean is, so it means basically in an inclusive system, you can actually have guaranteed ownership to the land that you purchase, and you can actually decide what to do with the land. But in an extractive economy, you cannot do that. It's insecure, and you might probably have heard some stories like the government confiscating the land from you, also deciding what to do with your lands and stuff like that. So these are the examples of extractive property rights. Next is occupation. It's very simple and straightforward. In an inclusive economic institution, you can actually decide where you want to work and what type of work you want to do, right? But for extractive, it's not the case. It's actually a forced labor, which is against your will, and you have to work where the government tells you to work. So next will be the new business, basically starting a new business. So in an inclusive economy, you can actually start a business quite easily. If you look at maybe some of the biggest countries in the world today, like Amazon or maybe Microsoft, right? They can actually start easily and then they grow bigger. But for extractive economy, these are actually monopolies, which means you cannot easily start a new, innovative business because they are actually big ones that are actually being run by a few people. So it's very hard for you to actually start a business under this system. So next one is laws. And the laws are actually unbiased and protect everyone in an inclusive economic institution. But for extractive, it actually benefits the rich and its relatives and a few people that actually have the power. So public service and an inclusive economy is actually provided. If you look at Singapore, there are so many public service provided for you, but for extractive economy, it is not. So that's why you will see some of the infrastructure and some of the roads are very poor and very torn down in some of the poor countries. That's because the government does not actually provide those services. And even if they provide, the service is very minimal and very limited. So next, so as a result, this is the conclusion. Inclusive institutions grow investment and innovations, whereas extractive institutions result in wealth transfer from one group to another. So that means under the inclusive economic system, you will actually see that the economy will grow much bigger and everyone will be able to benefit from the growth of the economy. But for extractive institutions, the economy will not grow that much. And also the result is actually the wealth being transferred from one group to another and the vast majority of the people still being poor. So next, and you will be wondering, is it always the case? Because we have seen some companies, right, which have achieved some degree of political centralization and they are able to generate growth as well. So what about those countries? Is it always the case? Is it true? So there are two reasons. The first one is innovation, because a sustained economic growth requires innovations. But in order to innovate, you first need to destabilize the established power relations so that you can get the innovation. Why? What does it mean, right? So it basically means, let's say like Google, right? Google is now very big and very powerful, and they are also very rich. But imagine in a very extractive country, do you think the government will allow the person to start a Google? No, because the Google will be actually in power struggle with the current existing elites. So the elites are the ones that actually have power and money in an extractive institution, and they do not want Google, right? They want to remain in power. They want to remain rich. So they are afraid of power destabilization. So they are afraid of innovation. So what happens? The result is actually a short-lived innovation. So even if there is some form of innovation, some form of growth in the first place, eventually the elites will kill the innovation. That's why it will only result in a short-lived innovation. So the next one is basically political power. So if you are in an extractive country, you will like to have political power because that power is actually within the hands of very few people, and these people have a lot of wealth, which are actually produced by the vast majority of people. So everyone that's interested is to basically to get the power if you are in an extractive institution, because you can actually misuse or abuse the power easily. So what happens? Everyone fight for the power. And as a result, the political instability remains. So these are some of the reasons why extractive institutions, even if they have some form of growth in the first place, will not be sustainable because they do not like their power to be destabilized, and a lot of people actually fight for the power. So these are two big reasons. So in conclusion, in 50 or 100 years, the US and Western Europe will be considerably richer because of their inclusive economic and political institutions. Sub-Saharan Africa, the Middle East, the Central America, or Southeast Asia will be most likely remain poor because, again, right, their economy and political institutions are extractive. But what about countries like China? As I've just mentioned in the previous slide, China, yes, now they have some growth and innovation, but again, right, at the end of the day, their political institutions and economic institutions are actually in the nature of extractive. So that means that their growth is not sustainable, and it will eventually run out of steam in the future. So thank you for listening to my presentation.